Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. We're going to have a great episode today, a conversation with Timon Cline on an article he wrote with Jerome Hazzoni and Josh Hammer for the Harvard Journal. And so this is a very prestigious publication they got published in, and it's a 50-page article that we're going to summarize on basically the concept of separation in church and state and how it's played out legally in the United States. And their argument in the article is that this needs to be done away with through Everson versus Board of Education. Before we get into that, I wanted to remind you of a product that I use called Farmer Bill's Provision. This is biltong. It's like beef jerky, but even better because it doesn't have all the preservatives and weird additives that you'll get in beef jerky from your store, wherever you might get beef jerky. If you're like me, you're always trying to up your protein intake. If you want to be healthy, not just maintain your physique, as they say, but you want to improve it, you need to be upping your protein intake. Most people underconsume protein, and Farmer Bill offers biltong, which is an easy on-the-go snack to help you stay full, help you get your protein intake for the day. You can head over to farmerbillsprovisions.com, use code FOOLPROOF, get 20% off your order. That's farmerbillsprovisions.com. Use code FOOLPROOF to get 20% off your order. I highly recommend this. Tastes great, easy, American made. I mean, it's a no-brainer. If you are into protein, you can lay off the supplements, you can lay off those powders, you can just pick up this stuff and you will be set for your protein intake. I also want to remind you of a partner of the program called Legacy Profits Club. Legacy Profits Club helps you get involved in the stock market by minimizing the downside risk and you losing your money day one in the stock market. The stock market can be intimidating for those who haven't been involved before. There's lots of charts, graphs, and strategies that you can employ, and Derek over at Legacy Profits Club can really help coach you and guide you and how to invest wisely. This helps people build wealth. It helps people be anti-fragile and develop a way of living which can be sustainable over time. And Derek can help get you there at Legacy Profits Club. Use the link in my show notes to sign up today for Derek's classes. All right, let's get into today's conversation with Timon. Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. I'm joined today by a returning guest, Timon Cline Esquire. Is that how? Is that your full name, Timon?
Yes, sure. You can say Esquire. I've been barred. I can be an Esquire.
That's great.
I just always think it's pretentious to put it on anything.
No, it is very pretentious. I've never received correspondence with that from you, which I appreciate. But you are the editor-in-chief, I believe, of American Reformer. Is that right?
It's true.
Still,
you don't know anything about me. Don't know my name, my job.
I'm just the most hardcore subscriber of your Substack. Which,
that's true.
You know, sometimes gets published, but you know what's fun is you're doing real world work, not just Substack work, and you are helping put together things like we're going to talk about today, a journal in the Harvard Journal of Law. And this was written with you, and I believe Jerome Hazzoni and Josh Hammer. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it's the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, which, it's where conservatives can get in articles on something. That's great. Anyway, so yeah, it's with my co-authors are Jerome Hazzoni and Josh Hammer, who no doubt some of your audience will know. And this has been this particular essay, which will be in the print version coming out sometime this summer. I think this month, June. This is some version of this has kind of been in the works for a couple of years. So this is a labor of love. That's great. So it's good to see it out.
Well, I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but we're going to work through it on the episode. I think when I first pulled it up and I saw you guys going after separation of church and state, I mean, I think that liberals would almost crap their pants if they knew that an article was getting published in this way, in this day and age, current year America, that there are conservatives calling for this to be revisited. So help me understand, and help our listeners understand kind of the history of this idea of the separation of church and state. Because I think that conservatives also kind of buy this kind of token, Jeffersonian ideal of this firewall, the separation. So what's kind of some of the background here of this separation of church and state?
Well, yeah, you're right about what I assume the response from liberals will be, because at last year's National Conservatism Conference, my talk was a very short kind of version of this argument that we're doing here, and I was called a fascist by several people in real life and online. So
Wow.
yes, that's what this will get you. But to step back and actually make the case anyway. It's interesting that you're right in what we kind of say is or understand the default position for, I think, most Americans of all stripes. Just depends on how fervently they hold it. The default position is we use the term separation of church and state, the wall of separation, which we can talk about. It's a stark separateness. I mean, however you want to describe it, these two never shall the twain meet. And we're right in a certain way to say this is Jeffersonian because of his famous tweet to the Baptist up north, which became, as we'll talk about, codified in our law, even though it was basically private correspondence to get votes. Jefferson's own, I'm not a massive fan of Jefferson, although I do enjoy reading him and reading about him. His own practice and kind of position is not what would today be considered Jeffersonian. So Jefferson famously says in his second inaugural address, and I think we quote this in the article at some point. He's sort of championing his first administration and saying like how it was the greatest administration ever. Here's how great it was. And one of the things that he highlights is that he did not bother the religious establishments of the states. So Jefferson, in his own mind, was a strict sort of constitutionalist. He had a certain way of reading it. Thought he was considered himself to be very strict according to the text, and he's simply saying in his second inaugural that he's respected the Constitution. So already we have an inkling of early interpretation of the First Amendment that conflicts with current interpretations from the man himself, Thomas Jefferson. So something else is going on here. We're immediately alerted to. And also James Hudson, the historian, has a famous line in one of his books, or maybe I keep saying these things are famous. They're like famous to me. He has a line in one of his books that during Jefferson's administration, it was totally fair to say that the state in Washington became the church. And he's referencing there the amount of state buildings, including the Supreme Court, that would host congregations to do their services on Sundays. This is during Jefferson's administration. He saw no problem with this. So the point being, many practices and things in Jefferson's day and from Jefferson's own words that totally thwart, the default position we're referring to, the strict separation. Strict separation today means not only no interference at any level of the government, but no preference for any particular religion, and even no support for religion generally. And this, through our First Amendment jurisprudence, though this is somewhat changed. We for a long time had a sort of secular purpose standard that was predominant, that required all government policy to be, that level of neutrality. So it's a sort of inverse in that way of you almost have to be explicitly hostile to religion in government practice. So that's where we are generally with people's understanding. And I think the best way to deconstruct it and to try to chart a different course that's more consistent with our founding and the general spirit of our country as it was established is to do what Aristotle says, which is you got to understand the origin of things to understand what they actually are. So people may remember what the first word of the First Amendment is, which is Congress. And it says that Congress can't pass a law, make a law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I have my own strange way of reading that. That's even more radical, but we'll stick with the standard. So the very first line of the First Amendment, and grammarians will point out there's actually not two clauses. There's one clause, but we split it into establishment and free exercise. What it's obviously referring to there in the federal constitution of the general government over the states is a restriction, and we could say it's a good way to put it is like a jurisdictional provision against the federal government's action, right? So the Congress is not allowed to do these things. It says nothing about anything else. And maybe most people don't realize anything else was going on. So what we try to do in the article is talk about and describe what it was like on the ground at the time of the founding in the States. Why is it phrased this way? It's because there's particular things in the States going on. As some people know, the majority of the states had what would be recognizable as an established religion and even church, even denomination today. They would be, all of it would be considered illegal currently. But the majority of them had them, and the ones that didn't still had a very general preference for a certain general Christianity, as later court cases put it. So that's the starting place, and that's why this provision is there, is that the federal government can't mess with those things. So you have Massachusetts still has the Congregationalist Church is the established denomination at the time. General Protestant teachers, it says in their original constitution, get tax money because they consider it essential to any good society and government to have teaching of morality and religion. The story there, too, is that John Adams is the primary drafter of the Massachusetts Constitution. He writes it, and he has that line in there that just says, teachers of religion or teachers of Christianity, can't remember. And the committee strikes it down and says it has to say Protestant. Has to be specific. So, and there was a Baptist on that committee. I've written about that before, Chase, on the Substack, and then had to backpedal a bit. I was trying to throw the Baptist a bone, but maybe he wasn't. Anyway, so point being, that's what you have. You have so you have taxpayer funded pastors. You have Christian religious tests for office, right? That will do even in Pennsylvania, right? This is like the middle colonies are much less rigid because they're much more diverse at the time. Pennsylvania required their office holders to affirm divine inspiration of Scripture, both testaments, right? New Jersey, next door, requires only Protestants to hold civil office. So you have that. You have blasphemy laws that are obviously of a Christian persuasion. You have same thing with obscenity in general, kind of other morality laws, we might say. So you have Sabbath laws. You have all these things. So that's what it looks like at the time that the First Amendment is ratified. And most people, I think, would find that strange and inconceivable. But it tells you why the First Amendment is written the way it is, what it was supposed to do, and who it's supposed to apply to. That all changes later, of course. But it was basically, we would not have had a country if anyone had tried to mess with the state establishments. This is clear in lots of good secondary literature from historians. Wouldn't have happened. Wasn't even on the table to do it. There was very little debate over it at the time over the First Amendment. They didn't think they were doing anything very radical or strange. Basically, the First Amendment means status quo. That's what it means. And there would have been no union because of the diversity of states on their particular brand of Protestantism, Christianity. South Carolina just says general Protestantism. To be an office holder, you have to be a member in good standing of a Protestant church that we recognize. No one could or wanted to mess with that, and you wouldn't have had a union if you did, for lots of different reasons. But so it tells you this is why this thing looks the way it does, and then we can descend into chaos as we go here. But that's our starting point.
That's great. Yeah, the history of it is very interesting. When 2020 hit, I started messaging with a bunch of friends, and we were sharing these constitutional documents from these various states, and I was like, this is shocking. Even today, some of them have holdovers regarding a general belief in God, which would be very surprising to kind of modern liberal, even Christians who they've been so beat over the head with this kind of principle being almost part of our Christian faith, part of our American freedoms. You'll even get weird contortions of what religious liberty means and justification. But this plays out on the ground in cities like New York, where church planters have tried to meet in schools. This is a common practice where many church plants get started. They try to meet in schools, and then they're barred from meeting in the school. They're willing to pay. The school is vacant on Sunday, but there's somehow an infringement on this kind of fantasy world of separation of church and state. I do wonder, wasn't Maryland originally either a Catholic or just had a high percentage of Catholics in the colony?
Yeah, Maryland's an interesting story. because yes, the charter is given, the royal charter is given to Catholics. They have always, though, have a majority Protestant population, even though there's sort of Catholic aristocracy for a bit. They try to thread the needle on that. And I think it's by 1660s, 1670s, somewhere in there, the Protestants actually overthrow the government and run the Catholics out of town.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So that's what happened there. But and then there's some kind of settlement later, but it's a bit tumultuous because of that. You had too many Protestants, but with Catholics permitting too much, papist stuff. So, so all of them, it's overwhelming majority of the people are Protestant. The scope of range of options in the late 18th century, it's pre Second Great Awakening, right? So Second Great Awakening is where you just get wild stuff. Before that, the scope of things is much tighter. So the craziest things you do have are like Quakers and Anabaptists, and maybe otherwise just heretical people like Socinians and things. I think Mark David Hall has demonstrated well, and I agree with him that I might even go further. I think the deist category is fake. I don't think it works the way people wanted it to. For instance, to be a real deist in the late 17th, early 18th century, or throughout the 18th century, one of the main things you have to deny is an active providence, right? So this is why they would have, earlier in the 17th century, a nickname for deistic people were atomist, because they just think the world is just atoms happening. It's just kind of like our modern atheists, the way they would view the world. And it's very evident that all the guys accused of being deist don't think that way.
Sure.
So there's something else. They're probably not very good Christians, something else. The only one that it applies to might be Thomas Paine. I think that's fair. But anyway, so the point being, your religious diversity, they think it's very diverse. To us, it would not be very diverse at all. It's predominantly Protestant. There used to be this myth that church attendance was very low, and that's been debunked a while back, a few decades ago. Probably between 75 and 85% people go to church regularly, not just on Easter. So it makes sense that this is the kind of place you would have when you get in terms of your government, a blank slate, but in terms of your culture and your history and your people, it's not a blank slate. There's over 100 years of people living a certain way. And then there's all kinds of explanations for various things that happen in the individual states, their process of quote unquote disestablishment. But up through, the 1830s, you still have them. And you have people, jurists like Joseph Story, one of Madison's appointments, writing that the First Amendment is not meant to level the playing field. It's not meant to prostrate Christianity. It's very clear which one's supposed to be privileged. What it's meant to do is make sure there's no sort of sectarian attempts to establish a national church that would subjugate the others. That's it.
That makes sense. Is there anything, this may be jumping ahead a bit, but I enjoy the history so much, but I do want to bring out the legal side.
Sure.
Is there anything that you imagine? I mean, I've seen a lot of guys, suggest various things that they could have put in there to kind of prevent or, make Christianity like more explicit, because it was so assumed and it was just the culture they were in. On the one hand, I look back and I go, how could they were obviously brilliant, much smarter than I. And, they assumed this would kind of be an enduring thing, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But, you kind of wish they would have been more explicit about what they mean. Because my sense is they're reacting against, kind of the British system, and trying to honor the Protestant American experiment that they're running and the heritage we have. Is there anything that you could imagine that they could have put in legally that would have kind of answered this question for all of time?
Yeah, I mean, this is like, this question is almost like one of the SNL skits or things like this, where they're like, why is it this way? Right. I mean, you're right to say this is all rooted in experience and expectations at the time. Just like if you look at the Declaration of Independence and look at the list of grievances, they're very much contextualized by what's what's happening, then what the purpose of the document is. And in the case of the Constitution itself, I think there's a very good argument that's been made by several people, specifically Max Edling's book is very good on this, where he says the structure and the language of the Constitution mimics and mirrors international treaties of the 18th century. So what this basically is in many ways, it mimics a treaty between a multiplicity of nations or little republics, and you will see people talk about their states that way. So one, we don't think this way now. Maybe Texans do, Chase. They have the most pride in this way. But if you're an 18th century guy, your country is your state. I mean, that's right. how you think of it. There's all kind. Admittedly, in the founding period, language is somewhat fluid, so you'll see terms used different ways. That applies like across the board. But in general, that's how people, that's where you're from. That's where there's people that grew up that would like barely leave their state, and I actually grew up with people and knew people that would barely leave their own county. It's just like their whole world. So this is one explanation for what you're asking is answered by the purpose of the document and what it's interacting with, and as well as the explicit limitations on what this governing body in this union is going to be able to do. And one thing that's very clear is the domestic policy, which is the vast majority of policy. This is what we refer to as the police powers, and that seems weird because police is now used in a different way. Back then, it's just policy. It's basically the same thing, but domestic policy, which is almost everything, except for foreign relations, the necessities of military, interstate interactions, those are all left to the states, right? So there's no need to comment on these things. They handle that. In fact, many people thought it would be it would already be an encroachment on them to even deal with the question, right? It's just not something you're supposed to deal with. So sure, there's plenty of provisions they could have put in there to make it clear to us in 2025, everything they want. But this is meant to be a very limited document. It has a limited purpose and for the general government. And, this is a compromise document over many objections from anti-federalists, who are wrong, poorly named. The anti-federalists, their issue is they don't think a national government, especially a national legislature, can possibly make laws that are fitting for this many people in this diverse of a place. And this is before the Louisiana Purchase. This is before westward expansion. This is back when you had several million people, not 360 million people, and they thought this is probably a problem. Madison writes, at length about this, and others do as well, the problem of attempting a mixed form of government in this way at scale. So, I think all those are kind of historic contingent answers to that question. And they also weren't facing the question we're facing. So there's lots we're doing today that aren't prepared for things we can't imagine. I think that goes with the territory. But the facts on the ground remain the same. And the activity or behavior of the states and their governments at the time contradict, the predominant theories about what is supposed to be doing in the late 18th century. And that remains the case up through the 19th century in many ways. I'd recommend John Fia's book on, is America a Christian Nation, whatever it is. It just points out that through the 19th century, if you had asked anyone, are you a Christian nation? They just would have said yes. It's just, it's a fact to them. Yeah. It's not aspirational. So they just have it. In any case.
Well, let's get to the case you primarily talk about in here. And I like the provocative kind of line at the end of the first section where it says Everson must fall. So we're talking about Everson versus Board of Education, 1947, a Supreme Court ruling, which kind of instantiated in a big way this theory of separation of church and state. So tell me about that case. Tell the listener about that case. Maybe, and it might be helpful to know for maybe not for the listener, just for my curiosity. When I look back at the middle of the 20th century and what was going on in the nation, particularly in the 60s, it makes me really angry because it seems like the people in the Supreme Court were just like all leftist, and like they were just like dissolving our nation.
Yeah.
I don't know what the makeup was in the 40s. I don't know if this was like we talk. I know liberal and conservative is kind of a tropey way to categorize people, but
Yeah.
maybe give some background there, but particularly on the case Everson versus Board of Education.
Yeah. To be clear, then the entire we do some of the history we were just talking about, but that's all in service to um, what we're the bigger argument we're making, which is um, the occasion for this is the Dobbs decision, right? Um, which is a watershed moment for everybody in the what used to be called the conservative legal movement, and that includes, in my mind, not just the lawyers but activists and commentators and people doing much of conservative world generally has been dedicated to, especially religious conservatives, especially Christians, have been dedicated to overturning, on demand federal backed abortion for decades and decades, so much energy and time, and rightly so. So Dobbs happens, and it kicks this back to the states, right? Which, as I think I wrote a piece at World a while back, we would love, you would love to have seen a federal ban on abortion. But this is where it always should have been decided anyway, and never should have been decided by the federal government in any regard, because this is a moral question. That means it's a state prerogative, according to our history and original structure. But that, in some ways, the victory takes some wind out of your sails, because now, in some ways, the battle's easier, but some ways it's harder for abortion. You've got a bunch of moving targets now rather than one. Harder to keep track, hard to keep up the enthusiasm, and it's just a different game now. So the question is, what at the federal level do you pivot that energy and enthusiasm towards now at this point for
Right.
the conservative legal movement? And our answer is, another case that is currently kind of flown under the radar, and except for people that are interested in this stuff and spend a lot of time on it, is Everson versus Board of Education, 1947 case that incorporates, through the 14th Amendment, the Establishment Clause to the states. So now that the First Amendment applies, you can't have an establishment, and then the rest of the history is kind of figuring out all the things that constitute an establishment that we got to get rid of. So our argument is we need to attack this thing because it's like the root of many of your problems, and then we go on to explain that. So that's the point of the piece. It is in that way very much a polemical essay and call to action for lawyers, judges, and otherwise activists. This case is the reason you get in any kind of legal trouble and have to go through the appellate system for kneeling and praying on a football field. Okay, this is like the source code on why that happens to you. So if you're annoyed by that, you should. Our point is look into this stuff. So the particular case of Everson is a funny one because it's fairly innocuous, and the appellant loses, actually, that it's named after. So the issue, it was in New Jersey. There was state reimbursements to parents for school transportation, and this applied to everybody. But obviously, if it's everybody, there were, I think in the as best I can tell, predominantly Catholic families that were sending their kids to private schools, but benefiting from a public reimbursement for busing, and or availing themselves of public busing, right? So this a New Jersey taxpayer, his name's Everson, he files the complaint that this is violates the Establishment Clause, the First Amendment. That's his argument. So the court in that case does what it often does, and if you kind of tracked a lot of the gay rights cases, they do the same thing, which is you rule in the particular case, and then you provide a lot of dicta about where you want to actually go, and maybe even do things that the particular, I think this is wrong. I don't think you should be allowed, but providing a ruling that is more expansive than the particular case in controversy. So you don't need to do everything you're doing to settle this particular issue, but you do it anyway because you want to, which tells you what you need to know about the makeup of the court, right? The question is not actually put to them because they decide 5-4 that the policy in New Jersey is not favoring anyone in particular, and the sort of externalities of that, like who, they happen to be Catholics that benefit. So what, right? You kind of have to get over it. But what they proceed to do, following something they had done about 7 years before regarding free exercise, is say we're going to incorporate the Establishment Clause anyway. It should apply to the states. You're right. This should be. If this was a case that was a problem, we realized we wouldn't actually be able to stop it unless the Establishment Clause is incorporated. So maybe there is a case out there, that's coming down the pike where we do need to do this. And you sort of wish cast in that way, which is also a message to activist lawyers, which is a general class, are fine, but you're signaling to them, bring us a case to solidify this that actually works, right? You see this all the time. Courts kind of hinting at what they want. Of give us something we could sink our teeth into and do what we want to do. So that's how you get this. And Justice Hugo Black, who wrote for the majority, provides his kind of revisionist interpretation of all these things to give you kind of the rationale for why they're thinking this way, even though, again, for the case that was before them, it doesn't matter, right? So they're putting this ahead, and you can look at the case, and we quote a lot of it in our article, but his history of America and at the founding vis-a-vis religion, would be very different than mine would be, and the history he provides is very scant. And so for instance, the money quote from him is, the Establishment of Religion Clause in the First Amendment, that's how he calls it, means at least this. This is what he thinks it means across the board. Neither a state nor a federal government can set up a church. So that obviously is not the case about what it meant. We've already talked about that. Neither can it pass laws that aids one religion, aids all religions, or prefers one religion over another. No tax in any amount, large or small, can be levied to support any religious activities or institutions, whatever they may be called, or whatever form they may adopt to teach or practice religion. So it's just this. It is the quintessential, wall of separation kind of understanding, which is something that you may ask yourself, why do they have this understanding, and what basis is there for it? Yeah. A similar thing had happened in the 1879, something like that, in something called the Reynolds case, which was about a similar situation. It was about the anti-bigamy laws directed at Mormons, obviously, and whether or not Utah's statehood was in question on this basis. And the court ruled, absolutely, we have the right to tell you what to do in your bedroom. You can't practice polygamy. Case closed, right? No problem.
Yeah.
But the court, Justice Waite in that case, goes on to do his dicta to tell you a little bit about how he thinks about the world. The best guy writing dicta ever as in our lifetime is Justice Kennedy. So, it's just like a diary entry of, I'm just going to tell you what I think. And this is the first time you see the wall of separation cited and attributed to Jefferson, and then put into the bloodstream of the court's precedent, even though for a long time it had little relevance. But this is how you get it there, because, as I said before, it's from a private letter from a guy to Baptist, and the guy was not at the Constitutional Convention, had no part in the drafting of it, right? But that guy, in his private letter, tells us everything we need to know about the First Amendment, what it really means. And that's how it happens. And Justice Waite was good friends with actually the founder of the Naval Academy, who was an expert on Jefferson. And he was walking around one day thinking about the case and thought, what should I say about the First Amendment? This is true. And so whatever the guy's name is, forget, my father-in-law will kill me. He just says, hey, use this, more or less. That's what he says. And that's how it gets there. So anyone who has a vision of like the magic magisterium in the black robes and like all this is somehow superficial and way we don't understand, please be disabused of how these things actually happen. It's as simple as that. Just it's what was at his disposal as he's trying to think about basically the second ever in 1879 First Amendment case. What do we do about this? We haven't had to think about it. So that leads you all the way to, that's some of the background for Everson, the case, we're talking about, they do cite explicitly the words of Jefferson, wall of separation. This is what the Establishment Clause means. And it has to, one of the quotes from Black is, the wall must be kept high and impregnable. Can't get through it, can't scale it. This is adding to Jefferson now.
Right.
And we can't approve even the slightest breach of this wall. It has to just be continuously reinforced and built. You must be vigilant. So that's what gets the ball rolling. And throughout, we can talk about some of the other cases, like kind of what it wrought as we go on. But that's where it started.
That even plays out today with, recently we saw, I think there was it a Catholic charter school in Oklahoma that wanted to start up, and then the Supreme Court struck it down. I think the woman, Amy, Justice Barrett, recused herself, which I guess good. I'm not sure. She seems to be ruling in ways that are very odd to me.
It was a strange recusal because if the given explanation for that is that she was involved when she was at Notre Dame with if I remember it right, it's something like this, like the clinic that from which a member of that clinic was involved in bringing the case. So the point is, if you applied, the legal world at that level is actually very small. If you applied this standard for recusals, like every justice would be accusing themselves from every case, someone would be gone. So what happened in the Drummond case, you're right, it's the charter school case, Catholic charter school, was essentially a 4-4 gridlock on the court, which means the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruling, which struck it down, stands. But there's no comment or ruling on that particular ruling.
Got it.
So there is no Supreme Court precedent for that case. Okay. What this, we say at the end of our article, what this actually, a net positive, we might say, because all it means is get a similarly situated case and bring it back.
Sure.
Right, because you had this recusal issue. So there's no in that ruling from the Supreme Court that basically we have to leave it in place. There's no explanation of why they voted the way they did or who voted the way they did. It just tells you 4-4, and we're done with it for now. So we want, we would hope that people just start bringing more, try to do the same thing and bring the case.
Yeah. Even out here in Boulder County, and I think it was 2019, there was a charter school. It was going to be a classical charter school, Ascent classical charter school, but the Boulder Valley School District wouldn't approve the charter. It was actually, I think, our gubernatorial Republican candidate, Heidi Ganahl, was part of that. She used to live in Boulder County and has since moved away. But yeah, they couldn't even start a charter school here. I don't even know if it was explicitly Christian. It might have been Catholic in background, but I don't know. That never got appealed or anything like that. But this is a very common case, like you said. So if Everson if it were to be revisited, and we can talk about how to revisit it and how to kind of attack it, like you've already alluded to, when something like that is overturned, if it's been used in case law as precedent for many other cases, do all those other cases get revisited then? Or how does it work in legal matters?
Those would all simply, any of the ones that for their ruling, relied upon the precedent of Everson for the standard, right, that they're approaching their issue with, their case with. Those would also no longer be, you couldn't cite them as precedent. It's in a string of, it has a lineage, right? So if you attack the root kind of case, the rest go with it. Similar to overturning Roe, right? You lose. You can't say, fine, we'll cite Planned Parenthood versus Casey and just get a later case. So all these go together, and the point about there's other things we could come up with that might attack standing Establishment Clause jurisprudence. But if you look at the cases that the big cases that we lay out that kind of string this along through, especially through the 60s and up through the 90s, where you have these, and there's tons you could cite, but the main ones, they all have to do with education. Every single one is about something to do with schools, the precedent setting cases. And I think that it makes intuitive sense, at least in one way. I would say these cases have to be brought. They don't just spring out of the ether. Everyone recognizes that at your schools is where you're producing, your whatever's going to come next. And it's very sensitive, kind of subject, and you have the parental rights issues and all these things. But it's going after the schools, as you see with many issues on the left, including, the sexual depravity. Why is it that they're so insistent on being around children and having education in schools and having the books and all these things and the curriculum, all this? They understand, the indoctrination program that someone is running, so they would like to have it. So I think, there's a reason all the main cases happen at schools, and the battleground probably remains schools in this regard. So I think that is right, at least provisionally. People can come up with creative ways to get at this. I think it's the most direct way to attack the precedent is to do something in the school context.
Well, since I've got a lawyer on the program, I do have a question. So one of the things, there's been a lot of articles. I don't know how serious articles are, but there have been quite a few. And I've been writing on some legal stuff going on in Colorado. Some articles will be coming out on that. But there's been a case, publicly at least, that people are trying to argue that the left regarding sexuality, kind of the alphabet soup, but particularly kind of radical transgender ideology, operates like a cult, and in fact, it may be a religion in and of itself. And I'm wondering, this is obviously going after Everson, and I believe this to be a more positive attack. If we were to take it a different way, I don't know what kind of attack it would be. It would be to say these things are religious indoctrination, and we're going to use the separation of church and state in order to ban them from public schools. Do you see that as a strategy worth pursuing at all?
No, I don't actually. I heard a similar argument back with, not on the trans stuff in particular, but back when debate about critical race theory curriculum was particularly hot. That's died down some.
Yeah.
Same kind of thing. That, like, how do you get out of this? One thing we could do is use standing under current understanding of the First Amendment as a shield in this way. I think it's a bad idea, and I wouldn't pursue it. And I understand there's always this conundrum, especially with the First Amendment, on what do you do? Do you get wins now, or do you try to reshape the precedent?
Right.
See this most memorably and evidently with someone like Jack Phillips. It's like this guy's life is on the line, his business, all these things. Like, you got to get him a win. However you figure it out, just do it. And that's what lawyers are supposed to do in the moment. But it's not very effective at reshaping precedent or big picture issues. You have to deal with the case you have. So no creative lawyers are great trying to think of ways to win for their clients, but I don't like it because it shoots you in the foot long term, right? And I would say the trying to reverse engineer and let's use a critical race theory argument. You can't liberate yourself with the master's tools, as a bell hooks or whoever said that, one of them. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, especially in this case. The trajectory is only one direction with establishment clause jurisprudence, and we would say it's anti-Christian. I'm sure there are people that were involved in constructing this precedent at various levels that actually hated Christians, and I'm sure there are others that it's because Christian is predominant in the default. So naturally, if you go this direction, it's what is going to be increasingly closeted and pushed out of public life. Either way, that's the trajectory, and that's the way it's gone. I don't think you can try to use that same bludgeon for yourself. I don't think you would win. I think it'd be very difficult to win on those arguments, because the Supreme Court already struggles to understand in law what a religion is. You can find this in various cases. They really struggle with that. Is it more like a YMCA? Is it more like what's it like? Like, what's the analogy? because our jurisprudence has been so sanitized of the presumption of Christianity as Christianity, just having a predominant place in the common law, and that is historical and basically can't be rooted out. That has been rooted out, and so now you have to deal with these things in a very strange, detached attempt at neutrality. So I don't think it would work for us. And then secondly, it shoots you in the foot long term. Anything you do to strengthen the Establishment Clause understanding, the current one, is bad for you. And we deal a little bit in the article with the Blaine amendments back in the day that were also in kind of reaction to Catholic immigration en masse in the 19th century around the time of the Civil War. The secularization, quote unquote, of the schools, the public schools at the time, would have seemed like a good idea, because the point of it is we're a Protestant country, Protestantism's still strong. There's a bunch of Catholics coming over, from Ireland and Poland and wherever else, and they're coming into our schools. We don't want the Vulgate read, whatever. So what we're going to do is say it's non-sectarian. These are secular schools. You can't do that, which was code for it's just Protestant stuff. They still did all the things.
Yeah.
That you shot yourself in the foot with that, right? Would have seemed like a good idea at the time. Very bad to start talking that way about your education.
Yeah.
And to start trying to set up laws that could easily be run with down the line, right? This is it just wasn't a good idea, but it was a ready answer to an immediate problem, and somewhat creative even, and worked for a while. So for all those reasons, I'd say anything that degrades our understanding of what a religion is, because I totally understand the cultic aspect of the trans stuff and everything else. It does function that way, but to degrade their understanding of a religion, especially legally, to broaden its scope to all kinds of things, any kind of conscientious claims without any historical reference, these things are not good for us. And then to continue to say we're chasing this neutral, non-sectarian dream of education and public life is exactly what's gotten us here. So
yeah, for sure. Well, tell me some about the cases that come after. You highlight one, Engel versus Vital, I think is how you say it. But there's several others that build on the precedent set in Everson. What are those like?
Yeah, I mean, just to give people like a very rapid fire picture of like where this goes, incredibly fast. This starts like 1 year after Everson, maybe not even a full year afterwards. You have a well-known case of McCollum versus Board of Education. These are all like landmark Supreme Court cases in this realm, in this doctrine. This is when the point at issue in the here is you have weekly classes that are voluntary for children, and they have to have parental permission. So voluntary classes for school age kids by parental permission in Catholic or Protestant religion, like theology. Generally, they're like optional theology classes that parents say, "Yeah, I want my kid to have that." And there were some on like Judaism as well, but the predominant ones were Catholic and Protestant. This is what's struck down by the court as this same. It's a year later, so it's still Justice Hugo Black says this is without a doubt an improper use of taxpayer funds, and this is an establishment. It must be struck down per the precedent I just wrote last year. That where I decided I needed to say this. Now I finally have something. Now that I've set that precedent. There's an issue now I've created for myself. Isn't that great? So that's where you get the ball rolling that quickly. They're ready to go within very short order. The Engel versus Vitali, or Vital, however people say it. There's a couple other cases in between, but this is jumping up to the 60s, early 60s. This is where you can't even have voluntary, non-sectarian or non-denominational, however the court puts it, I can't remember, teacher-led. So if the teacher's leading it, it's unconstitutional. Prayer in school, can't have that. The teachers can't do this. Even though the exact text of the prayer, so it's like written out, that they were going to use had been approved by the New York School Board of Regents, whatever it was called. And it was like, doesn't say anything about the Trinity, just says God, like a generic God, one time, and then says, Amen. And it's asking for like blessings on our school day. And that was it. Like, there's no, if you're any kind of Christian, how terrible. Completely non-sectarian, not just like, oh, this isn't a Calvinist one. This is, an Arminian prayer.
Right.
Nothing is as exciting or fun about that. And the court overwhelmingly ruled against that. So you can't have that. The court a few years later in the Shimp case says overwhelmingly, all these have like one dissent, and they're like weak dissents, but no Bible reading and no Lord's Prayer in school. So you can't have that. It's unconstitutional under this Establishment Clause we just incorporated, a few years ago at this point. And over the court likes to do. They want to play like the historian, but it's always really, really badly done. So now the court's discovered Roger Williams. By this point, they're trying to really dig deep on their history. And if anyone wants a really fun time, my standard of fun, they should go look up Glenn Moots' lecture on Roger Williams. He gave it New St. Andrews a few years back, in a way that only Glenn can give it. So I won't try to repeat it. But the point of Glenn's, and he's right, is no one knew who or cared who Roger Williams was until this started happening in the courts. Everyone forgot about him. He was completely irrelevant in the founding. You will not find him there. No one even knew where his grave was. No one cared. But all of a sudden now Roger Williams is like our first founder. Anyway, so they dig deep, and this has continued. I mean, it goes up through the 80s. In 85 in the Joffrey case, you can't even have a moment of silence in this particular case of school because people might be tempted to pray during the moment of silence. So Lee versus Weissman is when court, this one was tighter, but court said that the Christian and Jewish both clergy, or rabbis, whatever, can't give invocations or benedictions ahead of graduations or at graduations. So this is like how petty you're getting. There can't be any kind of, and to be clear, there's lots of places in the country that just did these things anyway.
Yeah,
right. For sure. If you grew up in the South, I still had them at my high school, if I remember right, in the early 2000s. So people kept doing this, but there's in the places where it's liberal enough to bring these cases because there's a problem, because you have someone that doesn't like it, right? Like if you're in Alabama in the 40s, there's just no one really complaining. It's New Jersey, right? You find the map hasn't changed that much on these general sentiments. But officially, and therefore the threat of getting in trouble is there, right? So you could do that depending on the community that you're in. So now you're relying upon you have it go the other way as well. There's another case, the Joseph Burstein, I think is how you say it, case, where the state Supreme Courts. So again, throughout these, a lot of times you'll see the state decision being subverted, right? So it's not just like this practice is happening, but the states say, hey, this non-sectarian prayer, we like it. Say it at all the public schools. And the federal court is coming in and saying, no, you can't do that, which is already a strange violation of the original understanding of the First Amendment. And its whole point, right, is actually you can't do that. You're messing with the free exercise of the establishments, as I would put it. But this was when the state Supreme Court upheld a state statute that said basically movies can't make fun of religion. Can't do that. And the Supreme Court strikes that down. Right. You can't say that they can't have this. You have to be able to do that. So because it was like a sacrilege thing, right? So therefore you're preferring something. So it goes beyond tax dollars, and it does go beyond education, and it right down to very sort of rudimentary things a couple hundred years ago that would have been completely acceptable to everyone, and they would have thought there's you have reams of cases from the early 19th century saying, open revilement of the predominant religion. Not only do we object to it morally, but it's really dumb policy. You can't have, imagine what would happen to you if you went to a predominantly Muslim country today, like a serious one, and are like, I'm going to do the blasphemous cartoons of Muhammad and burn the Quran and stuff. And I think your expectations would be fair of what's going to happen to you, right? And
right. Yeah.
So it used to be a much more moderate form of that in America, where they were just like, this is just not a good thing to have. I mean, it's not good for national stability and all this stuff. Very sort of civic explanation, but also that it was an affront to the established historic morality and expectations and religion of the country. And it was thought that the common law as a general system is supposed to protect those things and recognize them in the same way as like a brute fact of like the same way you would recognize the almanac existing. You would just recognize it's a Christian country, and then you move forward. So that's how far we've come. But it gets, as I said, now, you might have an issue if you pray as the football coach before a football game. You might have to spend several years in litigation to figure that one out.
So what then would be, with the Dobbs case, that was, I'd heard some people, some lawyers talk about different potential cases, and then they highlighted this one in Alabama, which ended up being kind of the great one to bring before the court in order to get Roe overturned.
Mm-hmm.
What would be examples of solid plays that you could bring to get Everson overturned?
Yeah, I mean, when you're doing sort of plaintiff shopping, right, is what you're doing. You're trying to find, what's a good looking case for us that we think would be, it's more than just being sympathetic, but a good situation that the facts will apply in a way, or will only be interpreted in a way that directly goes against this precedent, because that's what we're after, right? So you can't have ones that are kind of, you don't want to let the court skirt around it, right? Which is something like they were able to do in the Jack Phillips case. You're able to kind of get around doing it. So you want, as best you can, but facts don't care about your feelings either. So you just got to go.
Someone
with what
says
that. Someone says that, but so I think, like I said, this charter school thing is very interesting and clearly can get you there. We just need to be able to find out what actually happens once you get there. And even that one, it's funny to think about it, because it's like what we're having to do to get the federal oversight out of this issue and to apply the Establishment Clause, correctly, is to actually appeal through your state government past their decision, which is now flipped, right? In the not even 100 years ago, 75, 65 years ago, your state government would be the one saying, no, you can't do that. It's sacrilegious. And then we'll just call them liberals, whatever they were, appeal past that to try to get the federal. So we're having to do the same thing now, because the tables have turned. But I think that's an excellent kind of way to try to poke at this and see what happens, because it's not like you're saying, hey, can the new public school being built down the street be a Christian one? But it's these benefits, right, that are being offered to everybody. Anyone can try to do what this Catholic school in Drummond was doing. And you're just trying to do it as, I think it's sympathetic in that way. You're basically saying, I want, you're kind of doing the busing case that's in Everson. Like, I want this access too. I want these public benefits. And I think there's decent cause for hope that there's enough justices on the Supreme Court. Thomas has been the most vocal about this, about uncomfortable and willing to reconsider establishment jurisprudence. One of his explanations, for instance, that he's given in several different dissents and concurrences over the years, is that it doesn't make any sense to him, one, how the Establishment Clause can even be incorporated. So he would say he thinks the Free Exercise Clause can, but the Establishment Clause can't, because it's what he calls a Federalist Amendment, because he reads it more or less the way I'm saying we should read it, right? He knows that's what it does. But then his second objection is that it doesn't make any sense in the First Amendment to pit the two clauses against one another, and that we've swung in the direction so far that the Establishment Clause is now actually encroaching upon free exercise. And this doesn't make any sense. So how do you balance this back out, is a question that he would want to address. So I think cases like that, where you're sort of using generally available public benefits to do a otherwise innocuous activity, in fact one that is generally still considered beneficial to the public, to offer education, and go at it that way is a great idea. I think this is a great case.
Apparently, you have to find some state that is apparently more conservative than Oklahoma, because Oklahoma State, like, that's shocking. Right. I mean, maybe Alabama. Daniel Strand talks about Alabama being this Baptist theocracy. Maybe Alabama could do that. I don't know. I don't know.
Dan, and we love Dan, is from Minnesota, and is under, it may be some culture shock to him, is why he describes it as Baptist theocracy. I'm sure to him it feels that way. But I like to think of Alabama that way as well. I think too, one thing, I haven't looked at the makeup and background of the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and have no experience there, but it's also explainable in the way that when we started the conversation, we were saying this is the default position of everyone, even well-meaning Christians. If you were to ask them about it, if you were to just ask people on, at your church, can we pick a sect? Can we ban the Hindus in Houston can we keep them from building these things, these statues and idolatrous stuff? And I think most people would say, no, you can't do that. You can't stop them. That's their right, to do this. And then you can flip it, and you'll find many people there for like, can we prominently display the Ten Commandments, all over town at all the government buildings? There'd be many people, again, who are well-meaning Christians and otherwise conservative, like they hate abortion and things like this. They would they're conditioned to say, no, that would be, you can't do the religion thing on. So that could easily explain a very red state and even their Supreme Court, and say, well, you've got this type of conditioning affecting everyone's understanding, and then you also do have the precedent, and you're supposed to follow the precedent. So the Oklahoma Supreme Court could very easily say, hey, we've got Everson, we've got all this, this line, sort of string cite the cases for you. We can't do this. It's not allowed. And, you're just being deferential. So that's why, it is going to take a Supreme Court ruling. They're the ones that created the problem, of course. And because of the effect of incorporation, your state courts are generally going to be deferential to those cases, because the First Amendment's already been applied to states. It already does apply. So
talk to me about the counter positive, or I guess a net negative of this. Like, I'm thinking, let's say this gets overturned. Particularly, we focus on education, so let's keep focusing on that. In a place like Dearborn, Michigan, where it's mainly Muslims, or you think about a place in Minnesota where there's a lot of Somalians who are Muslim, they all of a sudden would be introducing a lot of false religion, be introducing false religion into public schools. Same thing in places in Texas. Apparently, they're trying to build some Muslim city. And so would this be permissible then? If this got overturned, would they be allowed to have the call to prayer in public schools? That's very chilling to me personally, but what would it look like then?
Yeah, so a couple things on this. There's one of my favorite cases is an unknown case called State versus Chandler out of the Delaware State Court in like 1837, I think is the right day. And I like it just because it's a window into, at the time, thinking about these things. And there's somewhat lengthy commentary on reciting the maxims that were still alive at the time, that Christianity is part of the common law, going back to the 17th century, to Taylor's case, and repeated over and over by people like Justice Story and others as well. Jefferson did actually hate that. He did write a whole thing about how that's really stupid and it doesn't make sense to him. But this was just accepted, and it meant, you have to recognize it and take judicial notice of it, just like you do, the time of certain events and things like this. In that case in 1837, they do talk about this. They say, look, the common law, the way it works in this sort of understanding of law and custom that's very organic and arises theoretically, from the people. You have a place for statutes as well, but the courts themselves, they put this like it's in 1837. It's so ridiculous. This is why they use this example as illustrative. They were like, what if a ton of Muslims came here? And imagine that, a ton of Muslims, and they like take over and it becomes the predominant religion and they're doing these things. And they're like, the courts themselves as guardians and interpreters of the common law can't do anything on their own to change that. You're just replacing the religion of the common law, can't stop it. In general, I think the logic of that makes sense. On the other hand, I think it's actually fair to say that if this begins, to happen, there's always recognition in the older cases dealing with religion, Sabbath laws, blasphemy laws, whatever. When they're talking about this place Christianity has in the common law, it's always got historical reference. So it's not just the people immediately right now, like what are they doing, but it's, in the sense, the people as they've always been, what's our sort of default starting place. And we're not, how do you sort of temper the moment with these considerations? So I would say in our hypothetical Dearborn, we do what we've done in Dobbs, but with the Everson, and it's like totally back to the states. You can do whatever you want, right? Which is exactly what we want. So you're certainly rolling the dice in this way, and those are other areas of policy we've neglected that have created those problems. But this is what you have. I think on the one hand, you'd have to accept, that might happen to Dearborn. They could do that. On the other hand, I think you could still object to these things happening if, for instance, you live in Dearborn or Michigan, whatever, and say, look, I don't care that Dearborn is majority Muslim. This state, Michigan, in this country, America, here's the history and, background to all of our institutions and way of doing these things. Christianity is part of the common law, and Christianity doesn't have to be prostrated before all other religions just because they exist or are around. The presumption is Christianity. So it's not like the court is taking a population poll or a census before they do their ruling. There's something else going on, and we totally have a right in Dearborn, even if we're, the 5% or whatever that are Christians, to object to this based on a sort of history, text, and tradition argument, as, someone like Justice Alito will perform in his case law. And then, of course, you have the final sort of, which should be definitive, but is less so now, which is just a moral value judgment, a positive prescriptive judgment that says this is not a true religion. We don't like it, and we don't, want it here. So you could try. I think you'd have every right to do those, but you would have to resign yourself to the idea that if we're going to think about the states in the way they did at the founding, Islam and other things weren't around for us, but this is what you accepted in sort of the bargain. Is like, for sure. I'm in Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania and Delaware might let Quakers run crazy, and I just have to kind of accept that. But I don't have to do it here. This is my place. So I think it's part of it. Yeah.
Part of the thing I've been trying to encourage Christians in red states to imagine is, one, they have to let go of their kind of libertarian leanings, like just leave me alone. Like they're not going to, they don't want to leave you alone. The left is rabid about coming after your children, about polluting your public schools, your public spaces. And so, I think of small towns in Texas, especially around Houston, Dallas, Austin, as these urbanites move out and they bring their policies with them. They typically start a hipster coffee shop and they begin propagating, anal sex and all of this with their flags. is there anything that these conservatives can, not just from an ideas perspective, but legally, like, my just off the cuff kind of remark to a lot of these people that I talk to is like, just outlaw the rainbow flag in town. Just say no business can have it. We have an ordinance against that kind of stuff. And you may have to keep, they're going to, if you do that, they're going to come up with some other stupid version of their flag that, looks like a rainbow flag, but isn't a rainbow flag. But like, is that the kind of stuff that Christians should be considering in kind of red states about how to prevent this kind of corrosion and perversion that they see in states like mine, Colorado?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, a couple things. I mean, going back to our argument we were just talking about with like accepting, liberals should be all over this in our call for like a reinvigorated federalism, because it inherently is accepting of a certain kind of diversity of ways of life.
Yeah.
Right. It's just at a corporate, communal, and collective level that they won't like, and they're not used to operating at this point. And it bothered Patrick Deneen's like pointed out this example before, and I forget the name of the community and the details of the case, but there was that case years ago, and it was in like northern Michigan, where a really small town had basically established itself as a Christian town. Okay. And they're not bothering anybody, and you don't have to live there. And like liberals went and found it and bring a case against it. They do actually stay awake at night knowing, someone somewhere is having fun, living the way they want to. So, it exposes what they're actually about. They're going to be the ones, fighting this tooth and nail, even though our proposal was, hey, what about, diversity is our strength? What if you just let everybody tolerance? It's maximally tolerant.
Coexist, baby.
Coexist. Why not? You could do this. And we also extend an olive branch to people that are, very, very concerned. And like, I understand this talk about balkanization and regionalization and these things. And we're like, on the one hand, this is kind of built into the system that you have. This is how, America was supposed to work for good reason. And it's just what we were able to do. It's a pragmatic, decision, but it seems to work well. And this is actually, again, how you hold the union together. If the union is important to you for what it's supposed to be doing, this is what they did at the founding. The only way you can hold it together is to let each state kind of have a lot of self-determination. So if you like the American Union, this is the way you hold it together. It's the original solution. You should do it again, especially now. At the same time, in these places, like you're talking about, where it is kind of an invasion of foreigners. If you're an 18th century person, someone from California is a foreigner to you coming into Texas,
Colorado, as it were, as we've seen.
These be total foreigners. There's a great letter there's a correspondence between John Jay and John Adams in like 1880 something, where like John Jay is so excited. He's reporting to John Adams, like, this is great. This is great. I have the greatest news for you, John. I heard about recently, and he says it's a boon for assimilation. And I can't remember how he phrases it, because it's not interracial, but it's like inter something marriage, because it was two people from two different states. And he was like, this is unbelievable. They got married. They're from different states. And this is going to be great for our country, for unity, if people keep doing this, this kind of like inter-ethnic relationship. They're obviously both like, white people from like, one's from like Massachusetts and one's from Connecticut. Anyway, so, this is how I used to think. And it's funny because in our current moment, like you almost feel that way again, right? It's so different, the ways of life. You do actually feel that now. And they would feel it too, right? It's just conservatives are usually less flamboyant. So you have to have ways to address this. And I think one interesting thing is you mentioned earlier, stuff that's sort of vestiges of the past, like in Tennessee, you technically shouldn't be an atheist and hold office still. In Massachusetts, there's technically still blasphemy law. Even more regular and kind of common are anti-obscenity laws and public decency laws, and the way that they're just ignored. And these are oftentimes municipal rather than state-based, because that's where the activity happens. And they're just around, unlitigated, just kind of left alone, like a lot of strange laws. I think, I would love to see someone, maybe they have, try an argument that's like, maybe you can't get the flag, but they usually do more than the flag.
Yeah, it always
Um,
comes along with drag queen,
there's a lot more
dancing.
stuff, and just say
Yeah,
this is a violation of standing on the books, black letter law against obscenity. And now let's look at, the last time we talked about this case was in 1920 something. So that's the only case law we have. Let's look at what they described as obscene at the time.
yeah,
And then let's, indicate that it's still felt and considered obscene, and let's get rid of it. I just want to see someone do that and see what happens.
that'd
Maybe
be
even
great.
for the flag itself, and say
Yeah,
this is not an expression of ethnicity or nationality or any of these things. This is an expression of sexual act preference, and everyone knows what it means. Why should my kids be subjected to knowing that the guy at the coffee shop, that's what he does at night, right?
yeah, right. Yeah,
Arguments like this, I think, would be people just need to be creative. I just want to see it. I'm no longer a litigator. I just want to see people try
do
some of these
stuff.
things. And
Yeah,
conservatives aren't used to, generally speaking, being offensive or offensive, both
yeah,
uses,
going on the
and
offense. Yeah,
and creative in this way because they didn't have to for a long time.
yeah,
So whereas our opponents were very creative in getting to where they are, and
yeah,
so you can, even though you can't use all the all their mechanisms and arguments for yourself, you can learn generally from the wisdom in using the system, I guess you could say.
yeah.
So I think stuff like that, people, and then apart from that, it's like a raw power situation. Who's on the city council and who's where I live in Southwest Florida. I mean, we've had this issue in it's a very it's totally red state and generally red area, and we've had an issue with um, the drag queen show that's happening this month, and it's just the city initially attempted to keep the show indoors was going to be their new rule. It's happened a few years, and they decided this year it needs to happen indoors at this public building, and where people can't see it when they pass by, like a strip club, right? So it's like you
Sure.
can't
Yeah,
accidentally stumble into a strip club,
yeah.
um, and especially because we don't want it in the public park with children. Not only did they lose on this, the city, and when it was appealed, but what's interesting for everyone, I just always think, is the people putting on the drag show were not satisfied with this. No, it must be outside. It must be in front of everybody in the pavilion area that has a kids playground and kids programming. It must be there, and it's a violation of our right. So they're not playing like nice. This is not a
Yeah,
live and
no,
let live situation
no.
for them. And as of now, I mean, appeals are still in process this week, but as of now, it is happening this Saturday,
Outside
um,
or inside?
outside, because they initially wanted the state appellate court. So there's been other the it's for a couple months now. It's been going around. So there's still appeals in play to reinstate a stay and all these sorts of things. But more than likely will happen, and this is in a very red area, and you see MAGA flags everywhere. It still happens. So there's kind of, in many ways, at some point down the line, you just have to recognize the fact of you need raw power of where you just have people that won't put up with this and do it right.
Right. Yeah.
Um, that takes time as well, and you
Isn't
have to
that
be
wild? I
aggressive
mean,
with it.
like, I see it in Boulder County. I drove by one. I told my kids to look the other way because I didn't realize it was happening until it was too late. And
Yeah,
we drive through town. We see the rainbow flags in front of the Episcopal Church and all this nonsense. But the being out in the public and this grossness, this perversion
yeah,
being so publicly displayed, you expect it. I mean, if I told
yeah.
any of my friends this happened in Boulder County, they'd be like, "Yeah, of course it did." But then
Right, right.
this happens; it's happening everywhere, and
Yeah,
like,
it is happening everywhere.
I want to inspire conservatives to action and agency and use of power. And unfortunately,
Yeah,
many pulpits are obsessed with uh, stripping Christians of even conceiving of gaining power and influence or
yeah,
exercising their agency or doing anything about it. Instead, they've bought kind of liberalism as
yeah,
kind of the de facto operating software for Christianity. And it's disgusting to me. It's absolutely weak. It's pathetic.
yeah,
And it's no wonder that so many men today find Christianity to be that way. They perceive it that way because they go into church and it's completely feminized and longhouse. I'm going off. I've kept you too long, but this is
no,
a major
it's
issue.
True. It's true. And you just need to get, you need to turn the tables again, where clearly to get where they are, the drag queens and everyone else, at one point they were the ones on the back foot all the time, right? Yeah. Like you would try to apply for the permit, you wouldn't get it, you'd have to keep trying, and like it probably wouldn't happen. And instead, that's the position we're in now, where it's like you're probably the one that's going to lose, and you're going to be tied up in stupid sorts of appeals for months and still lose. And so we just need, that certainly needs to be reversed, because the default has been totally shifted of no, we don't let this stuff happen. And there's no, historically speaking, and like objectively speaking, in our opinion, obviously, there's something like that is very easy. It is objectively obscene. Yeah. It's a blight on society. Something like that's really easy. The the more sort of direct application of much of the Establishment Clause stuff is somewhat more difficult in many ways, because what you would have to do if you won on this at the state level is you've really got to reform everyone's understanding of things, right? Yeah. You've really got to get the public arguments down, because it's so much more fluid then, and you would really be kind of ripping the rug out from under First Amendment jurisprudence, which everyone's like very settled with. It feels very comfortable. So you would really then have to up the ante on your sort of activism side to change the situation, and that brings us back to like what you're talking about, and we're just currently not prepared to do that. So that would be
the wild west.
One problem of getting what we want in this case. It's the only thing worse than not getting it is getting it. Is you and in some ways was similar with the abortion issue. I mean, it did not pan out the way everyone was kind of hoping it was, but also everyone wasn't really prepared or willing to do what was necessary either at the state level. And so many such cases.
Yep. Happens all the time. Well, Timon, thank you for your time. Where can people keep up with your writing, your work? Where do you want to put? I'll put a link to the show notes to the article, but where else?
Articles up at JLPP, and for most of my writings, usually please do follow and subscribe to American Reformer, of course. And we should be running stuff even this summer on a symposium on the 10th anniversary of Obergefell, for instance. So we do, if you're into these kinds of subjects, we do from time to time touch on legal things. And every now and then I write at the American Mind, other places, but check out American Reformer, and you'll get everything you're looking for there.
That's great. All right, Timon, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much, man.
Thanks so much for tuning in today for my conversation with John West. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. You can like it on YouTube, like it on podcasts, subscribe, smash that subscribe button on YouTube. Share it with a friend if you found this episode helpful. Maybe you know a Stockholm Syndrome Christian in your life. You should just text this episode directly to them and say, I'm here to set you free. I wanted to remind you about the Patreon. A lot is happening on the Patreon. We are doing a 1689 Sunday school over on the Patreon that is only for Patreon subscribers, and that is right now up to 4 or 5 parts that have been released. We're doing the whole 1689, and whether you're Baptist, Catholic, Presbyterian, Orthodox, or just not a Christian, this is a great way to get acquainted with the fundamentals, the basics of Christianity. We go through all sorts of doctrines. We go through the history of the time. But sign up at the Patreon today for $15 a month. You get swag. You get direct access to me, early access to episodes. So sign up over on the Patreon on the link in the show notes. And then a great product that I use called Ion Layer. Ion Layer is a medical grade patch that helps you get an NAD plus infusion. NAD plus is a naturally occurring amino acid in your body. As you age, those levels decrease over time, and so you need to supplement them. And a lot of people are going to IV treatment centers where they have to put a needle in your arm, and it costs thousands of dollars. Ion Layer has changed the game. You can now get these medical grade patches with Ion Layer that you can apply at home in the safety of your own, in comfort of your own home. and you can apply these patches to help boost your mental acuity, your recovery after a workout. These are really no-brainers, and they're super affordable. Head over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. All right, thank you so much for joining me today for Foolproof Theology, and we'll see you next time.